Good afternoon, good morning to everyone, and welcome to session 6 of the workshop on environmental human rights defenders in the Pacific region, strengthening environmental and human rights protection. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us for this session today. I am Georgina Lloyd, and I'm the Regional Coordinator for Environmental Law and Governance with the United Nations Environment Programme based in Bangkok. And I'm going to be moderating this session 6, on initiatives and mechanisms supporting environmental human rights defenders. So once again, thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to a really fruitful discussion during this session, which is going to really delve into some of the initiatives and mechanisms that are available to support environmental human rights defenders. We have 4 wonderful presentations and speakers who we're going to be hearing from. And then we're going to have the opportunity to have some interactive dialogue in breakout sessions to explore in more depth and to hear a myriad of voices around some of the continuing hurdles, but also some of the opportunities for environmental human rights defenders. So to start, we are going to hear from a number of key speakers, and I'm delighted to first introduce Nick Bull, who is the EarthRights Defenders Program Manager at EarthRights International. He works closely with human rights defenders across Southeast Asia, conducting research, providing support to those at risk, and building the capacity of defenders in relation to safety and security. He previously provided emergency assistance to defenders across Asia for the Asian Forum for Human Rights and Development, or more often known as Forum Asia. Before that, he worked at Amnesty International's head office, focusing upon strategy, evaluation, and assessing the impact of Amnesty's human rights initiatives on the ground. So thank you so much, Nick. And could you please share with us what initiatives EarthRight does to support environmental human rights defenders? Thank you so much, Nick. Over to you.
Thank you, Georgie. And hello, everybody. And thank you for the introduction. It's great to be able to join you today. And I'll go through a few things and look forward to discussing with you a bit more later. So EarthRights International, we're a non-governmental, non-profit organization. We combine the power of law and the power of people in defense of human rights and the environment. And we term that as EarthRights, which refers to environmental human rights defenders. So our specialities are fact-finding, legal actions against perpetrators of abuses, training grassroots and community leaders, and advocacy campaigns. So where we actually work in the Mekong region with a regional office in Thailand. We also have another office in the Amazon, and our head office is based in the United States. So our key issue areas are climate justice and accountability, earth rights defenders, which I'll be talking to you about today, and corporate accountability. So our training, we have different areas of work, one of which is our training program, in which we train emerging leaders to defend their communities. And in the training program, I'll talk a little bit more about this. We actually we train advocates and lawyers in human rights and environmental law, but also legal strategies to enforce those laws. Another aspect of our work is our campaigns. So we campaign to expose and prevent earth rights abuses, expose the link between natural resource exploitation and human rights abuses, and try to bridge the gaps between frontline communities and international institutions. And when all else fails, our legal program takes perpetrators of abuses to court. And we have challenged some of the most powerful corporations, and in some cases we have won against those abusers. So our initiatives to support human rights defenders, we have a number of these. In a session the other day, my colleague provided some information. The first of which is our EarthRights School. So we've had the EarthRights School since 1999, based in Thailand, but also elsewhere. And essentially, we use that school to equip civil society advocates and community leaders from the Mekong region to give them the opportunity to learn the knowledge, skills, and experience necessary to support communities. So it is a 7-month program. It integrates campaign, storytelling, and legal advocacy strategies. And it is a central hub for strategic organizing, movement building, and leadership development for those within the Mekong region. So another aspect of our work is we build linkages among defenders and their supporters. We work to develop strong networks of communities and civil society organizations in the region to skill share, learn experiences, and support one another, but also increase the awareness among communities, community organizers, and policymakers of the harmful environmental and social impacts of climate change and the fossil fuel products. We also enable communities, civil society organizations, public interest lawyers work in a coordinated effort and utilize legal strategies and mechanisms to protect their rights, health, and natural resources. Some of the ways we do this is with our Mekong Legal Network, MLN, which is an independent group of experienced legal professionals and civil society leaders defending environmental human rights in the region. It meets approximately twice a year to share professional development and skills share. And participants include professionals from Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Vietnam, Myanmar, and China, as well as in other international supporters. We also have the Mekong Legal Advocacy Institute, which is a forum for junior Mekong lawyers and youth defenders to share experiences, learn and develop new legal strategies, and take effective coordinated action to defend environmental rights in the region. And we also have something we're developing at the moment, which is an alumni network. We have an existing alumni network of those students who were part of the EarthRights School, and we're developing this and we're building a stronger network among those who used to be part of the school program. And we currently have hundreds of former students across the Mekong region now, and many of them are currently leaders in their own organizations. So we also produce resources for EarthRights defenders. Very much we work to build the capacity of communities, particularly in regard to environmental impact assessment. We also analyze repressive laws and legal provisions that are used to target defenders. And we provide EarthRights defenders with the tools and guidance to enhance their holistic security, so physical security, digital security, as well as psychosocial well-being. A few current areas of work that we work on is research in the form of needs assessment, effectively to learn the most appropriate and effective ways to support defenders. It's aimed to provide defenders working on the ground the opportunity to share their knowledge, experience, and expertise, but also guide future initiatives aimed at supporting defenders. And it comprises of different research elements, including a secure online questionnaire in local languages, interviews with defenders, and focus group discussions. We also have a Security and Protection of EarthRights Defenders Toolkit, which is a training resource focusing on the security and protection of defenders in the region. It includes content covering legal targeting, digital and physical security, as well as psychosocial well-being and sustainable activism. And that is comprising of a print manual of over 100 pages and also an adapted digital version of nearly 200 slides. Some other areas of our work include country-specific and locally accessible guides on the criminalization and judicial harassment of defenders. We currently have that for Cambodia, and we have similar initiatives hopefully going forward with a couple of other Mekong countries, very much examining the legal measures that are used to target defenders and a focus on security best practices. Another element of our work, which is increasingly gaining traction, is emergency assistance to defenders at risk. by which I mean we provide rapid emergency support and guidance in instances where defenders are targeted. And it is a small fund which we can provide assistance, including temporary relocation, medical care, but also support for equipment to improve security. And thank you, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you very much, Nick. And I think that that's a really good introduction to some of the mechanisms that are available to defenders in other parts of the region. And now we're going to explore how this translates to the Pacific. And our next speaker is the Executive Director of the Fiji Environmental Law Association. I'm really delighted to have Kiji Vukikomoala to join us today. Kiji is a graduate from the University of South Pacific and was admitted as a barrister and solicitor in the High Court of Fiji in 2000. She began her career as a state prosecutor, working for the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions for over 8 years before joining private practice for a short stint. In 2010, Kiji joined the Fiji Environmental Law Association, a local NGO, as the coordinator. And in 2019, she was appointed as the executive director, a position that she still holds today. Kiji has also led and co-authored a number of published law and policy papers relating to integrated oceans management, marine protected areas, enforcement of turtle legislation, and coastal fisheries laws. Kiji, we're really delighted to have you today during this session. I want to ask you specifically what mechanisms need to be introduced to further support EHRDs in Oceania and the Pacific. It does seem that there are a greater number of mechanisms that tend to be available to defenders in other parts of the Asia-Pacific region. And so what is needed in Oceania and the Pacific to further enable EHRDs to undertake their important work? Thank you very much, Kiji.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this workshop. As Georgina has explained, I work for the Fiji Environmental Law Association, and part of the work we do is to provide legal awareness and training, and as well as legal advice to advance sustainable development and the protection of environment through law. Now, in my attempt to develop the content of my presentation, I realized that whilst we are generally aware of the issues faced globally by environmental human rights defenders, I was not quite satisfied that I was aware of the particular issues that were faced by each different country in the Pacific or in the Oceania region. And the reason is because there is not really a lot of data out there or information related specifically to environmental human rights defenders and Oceania in the Pacific. So some of the issues for me include the fact that the term environmental human rights defender is not a term commonly used in the Pacific. You hear of environmentalists, just human rights defenders, environmental activists, and so forth. But this particular term is one that is not commonly used. And secondly, according to the definition of environmental human rights defenders, do we know what the status quo of that is in the Oceania region enough to make proper recommendations on the mechanisms that could support them? For example, are we aware of the number of organizations or the support organizations that could provide some form of support to environmental human rights defenders that exist, the activities that they do, and whether they do fall under the definition or only partly so. So if we are to look at the types of mechanisms that would environmental human rights defenders, we should have a clear understanding of, I think, what the issues are, what the existing mechanisms are that are in place, and whether these mechanisms that are in place are actually effective and functional. Now, from our experience and also from contributions from our partners that have worked extensively in the Pacific, like the Environmental Defenders Office in New South Wales, in Australia, and also, from if you've read the Human Rights Rapporteur, Special Rapporteur for Human Rights and Environment report, we believe that the Pacific is a much safer place for environmental human rights defenders if we are to compare it to other places in the world like Africa, Southeast Asia, for example. But then there are differences, similarities, and significant differences between the types of challenges faced by environmental human rights defenders, say, for example, working in Papua New Guinea, in comparison to a country like, say, Tonga, Samoa, or Fiji, for example. So in Fiji, in Papua New Guinea, we've heard of cases where there are threats of violence, shooting, some even fatal, deprivation of basic human rights by the police, for example, towards local community groups that are trying to protect the customary lands, for example. And those issues, scale of violence and so forth, are slightly different from maybe issues that have been highlighted in the Special Rapporteur's report, country report for Fiji, for example, where a country like Fiji has a relatively good set of environmental laws and policies, but there's quite a significant gap between its laws and policies and its actual implementation and enforcement. So the other issues that we felt should be highlighted in sort of examining what support mechanisms would be effective is, going back to the issue that there is, very little support, national support generally, given to environmental human rights defenders in the Pacific, and in particular Fiji, for example. They need finances, they need training, knowledge on human rights and the law in order to understand, what the legal issues are, and also to be more strategic in their activities. Environmental human rights defenders need to be able to stand up to people that threaten them. They need communication materials, phones and laptops and, cameras. They require advocacy training. They need media support and attention, and also communications training. They also need legal support, and they need to have some sort of national legislation or policy that provides them some level of protection. So in terms of recommendations, the first recommendation is that I strongly believe that there is a need to conduct an assessment for OHCHR in the Pacific relative to environmental human rights defenders and its status quo. It would be interesting to look at the existing mechanisms in place that are available to support environmental human rights defenders and whether those mechanisms are effective. For example, are there any existing supporting mechanisms for the local community, or do they only support formal establishments, organizations? In Fiji, for example, we have a Human Rights Commission. How effective that Human Rights Commission is in advancing the rights of environmental human rights defenders would be interesting to know. Whether independent assessment has been done, I'm not sure, but that would be very useful, because I believe Fiji is one country in the Pacific that actually has that in place. We also do not know which countries have national legislation that provides some form of protection to environmental human rights defenders that would be useful. How many countries have adopted the principles in the UN Declaration on Human Rights for Defenders? We also need to think about the need for financial and legal support. An organization like FELA, for example, which exists and provides, very important services to the community in this area, struggles to find funding to enable it to provide that particular service. And those who need this particular services, like those in the community, really have sufficient funding to be able to pay even a small fee towards that. So how can we continue to support those organizations that can support the work we do? And we also need to think of how we can build a strong local advocacy on these issues and amplifying those issues with national and international media. I know time is limited, so I think I'll stop it there. And I hope that has been helpful in some respect. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kiji. I think that was incredibly enlightening, and you spoke to a broad range of existing challenges. And one of the ones that particularly came home for me was the need for data, for information on the current situation, that there are a number of existing data gaps of what are existing mechanisms that are available across the Pacific, and more importantly, where they are in existence, are they effective and are they functional? So there's a great need to do some sort of assessment, regional assessment across the Pacific, to understand the scope of the situation better in order to then address those challenges in a more targeted and strategic way. So thank you very much, Kiji, and I hope that we can really delve into some of the issues that Kiji raised and maybe share some knowledge of where such instruments exist across different countries in our breakout groups. I'm now very happy to move on to the next speaker. We have with us Dr. Judith Preston. Dr. Judith is a solicitor who was admitted to practice in New South Wales and the Northern Territory since 1982. She holds a BA, LLB from Macquarie University, a Masters of Environmental Law from the University of Sydney, and a PhD from the University of Western Australia. And her PhD research looked at how Indigenous knowledge can be effectively integrated into environmental decision-making to achieve both beneficial outcomes for environmental protection and to Aboriginal self-determination. Judith commenced work with the Northern Land Council, primarily representing Aboriginal traditional owners in land claims in the Northern Territory and related to the needs of Aboriginal communities in the NLC area. She was instrumental in establishing the first public interest environmental law centre, the Environmental Defenders Office, which Kiji referred to, in New South Wales in 1984-85. Judith then worked for a number of leading legal practices, including Baker & McKenzie, DLL Piper, and undertook a range of commercial matters, which included litigation. For the last 12 years, she has taught at a range of educational institutions, including Macquarie University, where she teaches environmental law subjects at both the undergraduate and the postgraduate level. Thank you very much, Judith, for joining us today. And you're going to speak today on a particular tool that could support environmental human rights defenders across the Pacific. And we'd like you to explain the role of the Indigenous Navigator as a tool or a mechanism to support EHRDs. So please, Judith, over to you.
Thanks very much, Georgie, and thanks for inviting me to participate. Actually, I've listening to those other speakers, it's sort of from my long experience in different issues, raised a few things that we can probably talk about in the breakout groups. But just before going on to my presentation, what has become the custom, and I'm glad to say, is to acknowledge country. So I acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we work and pay our respects to Indigenous elders past, present and emerging. Sovereignty has never been ceded in Australia. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. There is a longer form of that, but due to time constraints, I'll just leave it there. Now I'll share my screen. So what I intend to do today, just very briefly, is tell you about a program that I came across in my research for my doctorate. It's called the Indigenous Navigator program. So just trying to work out how to get to the next slide. There you go. So the Indigenous Navigator program is actually very well explained in a set of excellent reports that have been prepared by the Indigenous Working Group, sorry, the International Working Group on Indigenous Affairs, and they're called the Indigenous World Reports. And I would recommend that everybody access online if they can these reports, particularly the ones in 2020 and 2021, which really delve into a bit more detail about how this framework works on the ground. So everyone can access the website. So you look up Indigenous Navigator and it will tell you, it will give you access to the tools and frameworks and reports that have arisen out of their work. So it's a framework and set of tools that are used for and by Indigenous peoples to monitor the level of recognition and implementation of their rights. So using this initiative, Indigenous organisations and communities, NGOs and journalists can access these tools and resources to produce community-generated data, so at local level and at national level. So it's a good initiative in that it's participatory, it's based on prior informed and free consent. It's a grassroots tool that help communities in knowing what their human and environmental rights are as in respect of various international conventions and agreements, and whether they're protected in laws, policies and programs, and if they aren't, how to improve the situation and hold their governments and businesses accountable for rights violations. They also can help access funding for projects that give effect to sustainable development goals, like eliminating poverty, promoting gender equality, supporting access to justice organisations. So what I've done, and I know that these slides are too long, but what I've hoped to do is put in place a lot of information that the participants and maybe beyond this workshop can use, so that you can explore how you can use this tool yourselves. So at the bottom here, I've got the program and you can look at that. But this was basically developed because there had been a lot of international legal framework documents developed, and basically, as it says in this quote, Indigenous people's rights remained disregarded and ignored. States had insufficiently reflected their rights in national legislation, policies and practices. And communities continue to face human rights violations, exclusion and marginalisation, and they're continually displaced from their lands and territories. Land is grabbed and lack of access to justice, as well as the fact that I'm aware that many communities face a lot of violence. As the speaker from Fiji mentioned, the situation in Oceania and the Pacific generally is a little less risky, but still people are subject to targeting from big developers and sometimes indirectly from government. So here is a summary of the tools database and comparative matrix, which indicates how the UN Declaration of Rights of the Indigenous Peoples are directly linked to human rights and labour standard instruments. There's questionnaires that are intended to be carried out by communities themselves, and national organisations can also use these questionnaires, which is a specific questionnaire at national level, to collect qualitative and quantitative data on human rights and environmental rights, more human rights than environmental rights though. So there's an index to compare countries' performances if they sign up for the program, in a sense, get some funding and some help from organisations. And there's indicators frameworks that detect gaps in implementation, holds duty bearers accountable and devises implementation strategies. So benefits of this program for communities is that it measures how 3 key frameworks designed to support human and environmental rights are tracking. That is the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples Outcome Document, and Sustainable Development Goals from the perspective of Indigenous people, not from the perspective of governments. The data collected can contribute to prioritising needs and formulate demands of Indigenous communities. So it is expected that different communities will have different needs that are prioritised and different outcomes that they want. It can empower Indigenous people on a national as well as global scale, so they can participate in workshops like this or in sort of international fora. It calculates and illustrates the levels of recognition and realisation of Indigenous rights on the ground, and it can be used to support advocacy to advance local demands. There's just a document there noting the different linkages and the way the navigator can be linked to human rights and monitoring bodies. So in 2014, the project was rolled out and piloted in 6 countries: Peru, Kenya, Cameroon, Suriname, Thailand and Nepal. And for the purposes of the Asia Pacific, Thailand and Nepal is relevant. So it showed that how the navigator tools could produce data on the recognition, protection and fulfilment of the rights within the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, or commonly known as UNDRIP. Indigenous communities who have applied the tools to generate data have more information to support discussions with their governments and external stakeholders about the promotion of their rights. They also have developed higher levels of awareness of their rights through collecting the data. 2017, the initiative moved into its 2nd and 3rd phases so that's 2017 to 2021. So for Asia Pacific region, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Philippines are relevant countries, but it was also extended to Bolivia, Colombia and Tanzania. So national partners and Indigenous peoples organisations in Myanmar, Norway, Sweden and Finland have also submitted proposals to expand the network or the navigator program to their communities in 2021. But I do note that there aren't, as far as I'm aware, any countries from the Pacific. I'm working to tell people about it in Australia and try and develop a way of getting these questionnaires to be extended to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. I haven't been successful yet, but I'm still working on it. So as far as the Navigator program, and bear in mind that these figures could be more, this was noted in the Indigenous World Report in 2021, so the information is collected from previous time periods. 165 questionnaires were completed, so that's 150 at community level, 15 at national level. So an engagement of over 200 communities in gathering data and analysing the data. 4 national surveys were updated, covering a population of 280,000 people by the end of 2020. Just noting, it's great that you've got that number, but given the number of Indigenous and local communities, it's still very low. So these tools, as I said, are a new grassroots participatory problem identification process, but also it gives data to communities so that they can use them in advocacy with sort of local and national and regional and international bodies. These results that are being collected often confirm the experience and observation of local communities and allow them to visualise and communicate the issues in a tangible and quantifiable manner instead of through the filter of government or statutory bodies. So the program resulted in 57 data-driven pilot projects. They were promoting innovative solutions for communities to urgently address issues. and their commitment in their communities created a well-supported base to make these projects sustainable. The Indigenous Navigator framework and tools provides partners with resources and flexibility to respond to COVID. And it proved to be very helpful in supporting Indigenous communities to carry on during COVID, because it was very difficult, not only the health crisis, but the lockdown, the lack of access to security. It made them more creative in terms of working out solutions by accessing traditional medicines. They also created different public protection equipment for themselves, and they find that if they have access to their lands and waters, that they're more likely to be able to get through the crisis in a better frame of mind and physically frame. So just to give you an idea of some of the impacts in the region, Nepal has 6 Indigenous communities who have actively used their advocacy, enhanced by the experience with the Indigenous Navigator initiative, to produce dialogues with local and provincial governments regarding access to public funds, social services and protections, which in turn committed to co-finance community proposals. And this translated into approximately 156,993 Indigenous people who are expected to benefit from these projects, which cover and address all 17 Sustainable Development Goals. In the Philippines, 11 communities submitted 6 proposals. Bangladesh, 9 communities submitted 10 grant proposals. And it is noted, and this is an issue that should be addressed, Indigenous women and youth and people with disabilities do have different needs and objectives. So the Bangladesh Indigenous Women's Network, working at national level, covered an additional 20 Indigenous communities, and in Cambodia, 4 communities developed 4 proposals. So the program and the data produces, it's controlled by local communities, and national Indigenous organisations carry out the national surveys. They produce several knowledge products in conjunction with IWIGA, so that they can then engage in direct dialogues and alliance building activities. So you can see one of them in 2020, ILO and IWGIA conducted a series of consultations, surveys and interviews with the consortium members, coordinators and partner organisations. And that led to a series of global reports and participation in high-level international and local events. So that has improved the advocacy for Indigenous people's rights. So just to say that the program is empowering for local communities. It raises awareness of for communities about their rights and contributes to the empowerment and ability to claim their rights, guides and orientates Indigenous people's self-determined governance, and develops strategies to be compliant with international legal standards. It holds states accountable by evidencing their compliance or failure to meet their obligations with regard to human and environmental rights, delivers data on the 2 subjects, and it guides and orientates development policies and development programs in relation to Sustainable Development Goals. I think overall it's a program that many communities can explore and benefit from, and I hope that I'll be in the future saying that that's what's happening in the Pacific more broadly and Australia in particular. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Judith, for this introduction to the Indigenous Navigator, which looks like a very good tool that can be used to address some of these data gaps that Kiji introduced to us earlier in the session. To continue our learning from other regions and our sharing of experience, I'm now delighted to introduce Mariana Montoya, who is a consultant with the Universal Rights Group, working predominantly in Latin America and the Caribbean. Mariana heads the Latin American Caribbean office for the Universal Rights Group and leads URG's global project on environmental human rights defenders. He is responsible, among other things, for the environmental/rights.org resource portal, which is a portal that was set up by a group of organizations, including UNEP, to provide access to information and other resources for environmental human rights defenders. Mariana also chairs the Supports and Solidarity Working Group of the Defending the Land and Environmental Defender Global Coalition. Mariana holds a master's degree in development from the University of Cambridge and a graduate degree in development and a law degree from Universidad de los Andes in Colombia. Thank you so much, Mariana, for joining us late your evening. Could you please give us an insight into the current research at Universal Rights Group on environmental human rights defenders? And are there initiatives that are being developed as a result of the research that will support defenders, not only globally, but specifically within the Pacific region? So thank you very much, Mariana. Over to you.
Thank you, Georgie. Thank you for the introduction. And just as Georgina mentioned, I work at the Universal Rights Group, and the Universal Rights Group is a small think tank focused on analyzing and strengthening global human rights policy across the world. And we've been working on the on the subject of environmental human rights defenders for quite a while now. And just before I start with what I have prepared today, just let me say that I do share Kiji's concern on the lack of resources and information on what mechanisms have been in place. And I think that's not only a concern that's specific to the Pacific. I think that's a global issue that we need to address. And in fact, that's one of the concerns that motivated Environment Rights, which is the portal that Georgie just mentioned, and the link I think has just been shared in the chat. And one of the tools that will be soon added to Environment Rights is a series of phone books or directories on different organizations working to support defenders. We're starting with some pilots. That's with the support of the supporting the Land and Environmental Defender Coalition. We're starting with pilots in Colombia, Kenya, and Mexico, but we hope to expand very soon to other countries in the world. And that's just our attempt to try to bridge that gap, because we believe that it not only affects support organizations, but also environmental defenders who are seeking support and don't know who to turn to. So I have a very short presentation. Let me share my screen. Because during the past years, we have focused on understanding what support needs the environmental defenders have, but also what has been working. So good practices that we can highlight and that we can encourage replication. We found that the challenges and risks faced by environmental defenders are wide-ranging, are fast-changing, but there are huge similarities across the world. And what's also common in these risks is that they all require systemic solutions that are cross-sectoral and that are multi-stakeholder. And that's something else that we want to highlight, is that during research, also partnering with UNEP, we've been doing research on good practices across the world, and we found that indeed the best impact is achieved when support strategies are designed and implemented either by environmental defenders themselves or with their support. And that also is to highlight what Dr. Preston just said, and is that empowerment and participation are key and of any successful strategy. Also partnered with that with a bottom-up approach in replacement of former and more mainstream top-down approaches that may not respond to the needs of environmental defenders on the ground. And the other thing is that no strategy is complete if it's implemented by one sole organization. And that's what we've seen is like, we all need multi-stakeholder alliances between environmental defenders, but also between support organizations, and where possible with the United Nations, with state or agencies or bodies that can actually help broaden the impact, the outreach of the different strategies, and also in coordination with other complementary organizations. So we believe that coordinating efforts is key in the light of scarce or limited resources and huge global problems. And lastly, and this was already mentioned by Dr. Preston during her presentation, is a different sensitive approach that recognizes that anyone is an environmental defender, and that environmental defender is not an homogeneous category. Environmental defenders are women, are youth, the elderly, people with disabilities. We have racial, ethnic differences within environmental defenders. So a different sensitive approach is essential to recognize that there are different challenges and risks depending on who is the environmental defender, whether it's an individual, it's an organization, or it's a community, and that each of them experiences the same risks and challenges in a very different way. And accordingly, the support strategies that are implemented must respond to these differences. So in addition, and we believe that these are just general characteristics that should permeate any protection strategy. And the other thing that we believe is that protection normally has 4 pillars that are interconnected and that should be addressed in a simultaneous way. And these are promotion of human rights and human and environmental rights, but also fundamental freedoms, and the vital work of environmental defenders. And examples of these include the United Nations different agencies and programs effort to strive for the universal recognition of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. We have organizations from the global level that are working towards a positive narrative of environmental defenders that debunks misconceptions about that environmental defenders being anti-development or being obstacles to progress, among other things. Or we have more concrete examples in the world and specific laws and framework on environmental defenders that recognize them and recognize their specific rights. And also at the promotion level, we have efforts to strengthen the rule of law in general and the policy frameworks more broadly, not just limited to environmental defenders, but in general, promoting environmental protection and addressing environmental degradation before it even happens. And that takes me to the second point, and is prevention. Prevention is key, and we are very used to understanding protection as response, but prevention is the most important part, in my opinion, of any protection strategy, and particularly when it comes to upstream or primary prevention, and it means addressing environmental degradation or human rights violations even before they start. So addressing the root causes, addressing the rule of law, and strengthening institutions. And we have a lot of examples in the Pacific that are directed towards these primary prevention efforts, and they include efforts by different civil society organizations offering livelihood support, sustainable livelihood support to communities, also training and promoting a rights-based culture that it's respective of the environment and also of those who defend the environment. And key here in prevention is addressing discrimination and marginalization, and that includes historical issues such as discrimination based on gender, discrimination based on ethnicity, or on race, and all these efforts that we have trying to overcome those are also part of prevention. as well as promoting public participation and increasing transparency in the region. The other set or part of protection that we've seen is response, and it's early response mechanisms that address threats before they even escalate. This includes community-based monitoring, information system, protection and handbooks, also environmental clinics, and we see that there are environmental clinics in different parts of Asia and the Pacific that address or provide legal advice to environmental defenders as soon as they see threats, and not letting them go even further. So this means we have some early response mechanisms, and ideally this should be complemented with early warning systems that will be binding for state authorities and even companies. These are, of course, way more scarce. Unfortunately, I don't know any at the moment. But there are a lot of intentions to build this early warning system. And these are normally also paired with emergency response assistance, emergency response funding, and rapid response mechanisms that will help with relocation, and ideally a relocation that it's culturally appropriate for the person that needs to be relocated, but also with offering funds and also legal assistance, which is key to face the challenges and threats. And there's also another important thing in the part of response, and securing and implementing holistic strategies that are not just based on individual security or security of the person, but also of the communities, that do not disrupt the social tissue, that bear in mind that the consequences of the violence or the different threats are just not only faced by an individual, but also by families and communities more in general. And that also address digital and also self-care and so psychosocial well-being, which is very much in line with what Nick exposed earlier before about what EarthRights is currently doing. And finally, within the response category, there are many strategies to secure truth, justice, and accountability, and we believe that this is key, also a key part of a strategy to address human rights violations and environmental degradation. And accountability and truth are not just only achieved by judges or lawyers, but their communities themselves and civil society organizations play a very important role in the light of a judiciary that just won't help or won't initiate effective investigations. And in this regard, there are also the UN mechanisms, including the special rapporteurs and treaty bodies, have played an enormous role in helping protect the right to truth, especially of the victims of human rights violations. And then finally, and this is for me the most basic part of protection, and is respect, and is understanding that every single stakeholder, be it states, United Nations, civil society organizations and companies, the minimum that they can do is not to harm, not interfere, or not curtail the rights of environmental defenders, and that includes, of course, harming the environment. This is the hardest, perhaps, but should be and is the most basic, the most basic step that everyone should be implemented. And examples of the respect part are the efforts at the UNEP, at the OHCHR, to encourage the adoption and the observance of, for example, the free, prior and informed consent, putting the no harm principle at the core of all the activities, and consulting with communities before developing programs. Just to across, as I mentioned before, as part of all our our research, we found that there's a lot to be done still in terms of access to information, including to environmental decision-making information, also to human rights information, and it's empowering communities on what are their rights, what rights do they have as environmental defenders, who is an environmental defender, and that very much relates also with what Kiji was saying earlier before, and we have so many different broad terms that sometimes create confusion in defenders, and that impedes or that makes it difficult for them to access support. So letting them know who they are and who can support them is a key strategy, as I was mentioning before. Also what works and what can be done. And to address this, we're working with UNEP, actually with the OHCHR, and we're working with the Defending Milan Environmental Defender Coalition to build a series of tools that should be digital tools, online free digital tools for defender to be accessed from any country in the world, so they can know who is there to support them, what kind of support strategies have been implemented that have been successful, what good practices exist, and for civil society organizations, how can they strengthen the strategies that they are currently implemented, with who can they partner to increase their outreach, to increase their impact, to coordinate efforts, and to fill gaps in protection that can be something very common, including when civil society organizations ourselves are not able to provide certain assistance, knowing who we can refer defenders to. And I know that I'm running out of time, so I'm gonna just conclude here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mariana. And that the database and the resource portal of environmental rights is a really useful tool. And as you said, we look forward to those additional online resources that are going to be uploaded onto that portal. We are now going to have an opportunity to ask some more questions, explore our own thoughts, experience, and perspectives on these issues in breakout sessions. These breakout sessions are going to focus on a number of key questions. I will now share my screen, which has the questions up that we are going to explore in breakouts. We are actually going to focus on questions 1 and 4 first, and then move to questions 2 and 3 if time allows. We really want these questions and your discussions that you have to perhaps provide further priorities for ongoing work in the Pacific, and provide a focus on where OHCHR and UNEP can focus our subsequent activities. So the first question is, what type of support is needed for EHRDs on the ground? The fourth question that we would like you to focus on next is, what would foster a strong network for EHRDs in both the Pacific and the wider Asia Pacific region and make it resilient? So we're going to focus on those 2 questions first, and then move on to questions 2 and 3 if you have time. Thank you very much, and welcome back to the plenary. We had some fantastic points raised in our breakout group, and I'm sure the other group was similar. So I'm now going to ask each of the facilitators to summarize the discussions within their breakout groups. So if I can turn first to Joe. And Joe, could you let us know the key points that were raised within your group? You have about 4 minutes or so to do the report back. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Georgina. So under the first question, well, first of all, many thanks to our colleagues who provide valuable contributions in terms of answering the questions. The first question is, what type of support is needed for EHRDs on the ground in the Pacific? And so we identified that one of the key areas is in terms of access to justice, and access to justice for EHRDs working within their space, in terms of access to information and the right information, what are the available services that can provide support to them and enable the space that they're in, whether it's particularly in terms of the formal justice systems, and allowing them to access this under the heading of access to justice for EHRDs, and noting that there are limited resources. to consolidate all the information or all the initiatives or resources that are readily available across the Pacific with those that are working in frontline environmental issues, and now allowing that in terms of top of our head in terms of brainstorming, possibly a repository on where EHRDs and those supporting work environment can access this information. Another key area that was identified under the question 1 on support for EHRDs is a collective alliance in the Pacific, and not just the Pacific, but the wider Pacific, and really ensuring that there's a holistic, integrated approach in identifying issues that are dealt by these collectives. And one was that highlighted was, there are violations suffered by EHRDs in terms of intimidation and so forth, but also to highlight subtle forms of violations and intimidations. For example, EHRD lawyers working within the court system being intimidated by personnel within the court process, whether from the clerks right across to judges and the like, as well as from the authorities. Under that key area of collective alliance and networking is a mapping process. A mapping process to see all the key players, the frontline actors, and stakeholders that are working within this space in the Pacific, and I think that will lend a lot to further initiatives and discussions to build on the networks and expand on the networks. A third point that was raised under question 1 was integration of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous-based knowledge. And I'll refer to my colleagues, of course, in terms of the phrasing, but essentially what it underscores is to ensure that the traditional knowledge is part of the process, is part of the initiatives that we identify in terms of support, and that's akin to, in terms of climate change, early warning systems, mitigation and resilience, that this also dovetails into the setting up of initiatives and the work that we're doing in terms of enabling, providing support to environmental human rights defenders, that this in itself is a reservoir of knowledge that should be included. Another point on support is strong coordination support in terms of logistics. You have environmental human rights defenders that are not necessarily affiliated with established organizations in the region, but they do the work of EHRDs, while at the same time highlighted by Kiji that they may not identify as environmental human rights defenders, or that definition may not be part of common parlance in the Pacific. Nevertheless, they do the work of EHRDs, and equally they require the logistical support and administration, where they're working on their own, out of pocket, in terms of their operations, and that it's key that this is a gap and a divide that needs to be closed in order to empower them and ensure that the space that they're working within is an enabling space. So that would come under coordination. To the fourth question, which sort of links up very well with the third area on coordination in question 1. So the fourth question is, what would foster a strong network for EHRDs and make it resilient? Again, it's under that coordination and networking. One of our participants, David, likened it to the PHRD and Pacific Human Rights Defenders Network, of which OHCHR is the secretariat. But to further note that the flip side of that is why it hasn't necessarily been set up fully for the purpose that it was, perhaps because of the 2 waves within Fiji on COVID-19 and a plethora of other reasons in terms of financing and the like, and commitments from stakeholders. But more importantly, it was to close the gap on stakeholders and EHRDs working in silos. The idea of it, and it's underscored by the term solidarity. This is to strengthen solidarity amongst EHRDs across the Pacific through networking and through coordination, and building on these networks in order to connect everyone without the ongoing practice that's seen in certain sectors on working in silos and insulated workspaces and work areas in terms of coordination and networking. So I hope I've captured that discussion, and that was the main points from our discussion. So over to you, Georgina.
Thank you very much, Joe. And I'm going to pass it straight on to Nick to summarize the discussion in the second breakout room. So Nick, over to you. If you could do it in 3 minutes or so, that would be brilliant.
I will try. Thank you, Georgina. Okay, thank you very much to my group and for all the inputs from everybody. So in response to the first question, what types of support is needed for defenders on the ground? There are a few different points. One element which was focused on is the need to have an assessment of the needs of the defenders on the ground, but also looking very much at building the capacity of defenders in the region and also developing that network. There was key focus on the need to look at safety and security and focus on building capacity and assistance provided from organizations and others outside. But there was also a focus on the need to have support in regard to legal assistance, but an underlying theme throughout the two question discussions was the importance of having financial support, both in terms of supporting defenders on the ground with specific instances, but also the wider networks. And there was also a focus on livelihood support, the importance of actually recognizing that defenders often undertake the work on a voluntary basis, and that there should be a focus on supporting them to enable them to actually continue their work. In regard to the second question, what would foster a strong network for defenders in both Pacific and wider Asia Pacific region and make it resilient? There were a few points which came up. The first one is teamwork and coordination, ensuring that bringing existing organizations together to connect with others. A focus on accountability and responsibility, and also a key point which was raised was having that shared aim and objective and agreement among defenders and defender organizations within the Pacific, bringing them together under a united focus. As well as that, the need to have a legal framework for defenders and the importance of ensuring funding is actually enabled so that there is the ability to have that sustainable network, and also to focus on existing initiatives, those existing organizations and groups which could actually form wider networks, and also working together and fostering networks, ensuring that there is an identified lead to actually coordinate and take responsibility for the networks. I think that's a very brief summary, and hopefully it was under the 3 minutes, Georgie.
Thank you, it was perfect. So I think there were some very important points raised in both of the groups. There is clear that there's a lot of support that is still needed across the Pacific to provide appropriate mechanisms and tools for environmental human rights defenders to effectively do their important, legitimate work. So thank you again to all of our speakers. Thank you to Mariana, thank you to Judith, thank you to Kiji, and thank you to Nick. And thank you everyone for your inputs during the breakout sessions.